All right, we are live. We're talking about launching MedTech products faster, better, and cheaper, and we have the guru, the ultimate guru with us here on this, Mr. Chris Morrison. Chris, it's great to have you. Remember, we'll fool around a little bit before we get going because we want to make sure we're streaming out to YouTube, we're streaming out to LinkedIn, all that good stuff. So how you doing?
I'm doing well today. You got people in your background today.
Yeah, you like that? I got my last client hanging out. So
there you go.
That's Atticus. Yeah. He's rocking and rolling back there. That's That's ADHD stuff we're talking about.
Oh, right.
Pretty interesting, right?
About that, so. But in answer your question, Dave, I'm doing good. It's a beautiful day.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah, kind of got lots going on these days, all over the place.
Chris, 30 years of experience in this space. 30 years, is that about right? MedTech?
No, probably closer to 40 now. Scared. Well, yeah, 30 doing the sales piece of it and the product, and the product launch and the.
Okay. And when did you come up with when did you really start putting agile market entry together and really start pushing it out into the marketplace?
It's probably about 15 years ago. I was sitting down having a conversation with a client colleague, a good friend of mine, Lana Williams, and we were just chatting about how she and I could sell this disruptive technology we had for it was a clinical diagnostic for depression, way ahead of
That's amazing. And then you've been refining it ever since. The playbook, clients using the playbook.
She asked me a quick question. She said, "Why can you and I sell, and the other sales reps we hired can't sell this?" And it got me thinking. And then I started looking for a playbook for selling disruptive technologies.
And it wasn't there.
It wasn't out there. So that is probably 15 years ago, but probably about 7, 8 years ago, I really started pulling it all together because all it was bits and pieces up to then I started pulling it into the framework. So,
and that's really what Agile is. It's such a beautiful thing. You pull different, really cool things together, and you formulate a go-to-market strategy or a work strategy. And this is a work strategy. So what I'm really trying to get at here is Chris is the expert. I mean, if you want to talk about MedTech product launch, you got the expert here. He's been there and done that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, reducing internal investment, hopefully be able to maximize market impact. And Chris calls that the Goldilocks Formula. So we'll talk more about the Goldilocks Formula. Yes. We'll talk about quickly validating or invalidating. Remember, it's best to get to know as fast as possible or understand yes as well as you can. And the assumptions so that we can create stronger salespeople for these disruptive products. We'll talk about that. We can talk about the fact that you do have to align sales, marketing, R&D, and product management effectively. There is an alignment factor, right, Chris?
Yep.
So, all right. And then finally, we'll talk about selecting and empowering the right talent. This is probably where some of the biggest mistakes occurs on the bringing in the talent to do this, right, Chris?
Well, most people don't even think about the specific talent for this. It's just completely overlooked.
So let's get into it. Let's talk about disruptive versus incremental.
Yeah.
Just go at it. Disruptive versus incremental. There's a confusion. There's lack of understanding. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I got this question actually just yesterday in a conversation. But it's a good question because with incremental products, which most products are, a traditional sales model works pretty well for launching it. But so what's the difference between disruptive and incremental?
Yeah.
Other than the description. So just some examples of disruptive. The internet, when it was first introduced, was definitely disruptive. Right now, AI right now, obviously, is a disruptive technology. But kind of the fundamental thing about disruption, in my mind, is it forces the user to change their behavior in some way.
The customer is going to change their behavior because of the technology.
And it could make, and we're seeing this with AI, it's changing the way we're thinking too, which is even more difficult than behavioral change. But most of the time with disruptive technologies, it can include both, but it often requires behavior change. For instance, going from open surgery to minimally invasive surgery actually requires a surgeon to perform a whole different type of procedure.
Yeah, I've learned a lot about that recently in the training that's required, right?
Yeah, well, and it's not just training; it's a whole new. A lot of times, it's a whole new skill set.
It's almost like you got to believe that that's better. Like, okay, I believe it's better, so I got to be taught that it's better. Then you got to sell it in such a way to help them understand it's better before maybe they even buy it.
Well, the interesting about it is, that's kind of the underlying assumption for launching a product like that is it's better, right? And
Yeah,
it's pretty,
but that's your assumption, right? What your whole model is trying to figure out if the customer thinks that way.
Well, part of it's figuring out the customer perception, right? So that's kind of from the sales perspective. But then there's also the perspective from how they, the physically how they have to change their, behavior, how they have to, do the procedure, how they have to adopt the technology, that type of stuff. So there's a sales component of it, but there's also the adoption component of it too. That's included with disruption that you have to address and overcome.
So really, one of the things you talk about is also business model oriented, right? So you explain some business model things related to inpatient versus outpatient versus ASC. So It's a business model disruption too that could happen.
So it doesn't have to be just it doesn't have to be a product level or the levels. It can be a business model disruption.
But what you're really getting at, your customer's behavior is going to change or has to change because of this disruptive product. You may feel that it's better, but the customer is going to have to change.
The customer's going to have to change, and we all know change is very difficult. And so when you're talking disruptive, that's what when we're talking about disruptive product, that's kind of what we're talking about.
And when you talk to your big company friends, what do they say to you? You talk to your big company friends. When you talk to your big company friends about this, what do they say to you about big companies being disruptive or innovative?
Well, a couple things are going on at the big company level I'm talking to friends about. One is most big companies aren't really doing disruption. They're not doing disruptive products. It's kind of been
They don't,
but and for good reason, because they tried to bring it into their systems of doing things, and it doesn't. They can't successfully do it.
They don't have the process. They don't have the methodology. They don't have the training, realizing it's a separate function.
And even the thinking, their VP of sales doesn't know how to manage disruption. Their sales force doesn't know how to manage disruption. Their whole culture isn't a disruptive type culture. So bringing in you have to bring in disruptive methodologies in order to manage
they don't do that.
Technologies, and they don't do that. So
they buy a lot. Don't they buy a lot of that? Don't they try to buy a company to do that?
Yeah.
And how many of those actually work? One plus one never equals two.
I worked with a company about 10 years ago in the MedTech space, in the ophthalmology space. It got bought by J&J. And 10 years later, it's doing 10% of the volume it did when they bought.
All of us will have stories about that. And by the way, if you have a story or question or comment you want to make, don't hesitate to share it in the chat or comment section there. We'd love to engage. So if you have any thoughts, please don't hesitate to throw that at us. So ultimately, the numbers you see based on the studies is that you want to make additional profit. You got to innovate in disruption.
So we're missing, especially in big companies. Small startups are designed around this, but only 14% of the innovation is disruptive. Or let me rephrase it: only 14% of new products are disruptive, but those disruptive products drive 61% of margin. So by not doing this well, or outwardly avoiding it, not doing it in big companies, we're missing a huge opportunity. In the scenario of acquiring in technology and not taking advantage of it, again, we're missing huge opportunity.
Okay, so it is. And VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, is showcased itself with Gen AI and other technologies to say it's change is moving faster, making things more chaotic. And if you don't have methodology by which to sell in that chaos.
Yep. And I think there's a couple things inside of that, Dave. One is the world's changing so much quicker anymore that none of us can avoid disruption. I mean, my life is disrupted.
I haven't been able to. I'm like massive disruption right now.
So I was on a webinar with a friend of mine, Hamid Ganadan, with the Linus Group, who's an expert in marketing to scientists in the life science space. And he made a comment. He says, you can't not innovate anymore.
Yeah.
It's, big, small, you can't, because that's what the world's doing. So this at this point in time, big companies have to figure out how to do this, and that's what Agile Market Entry is designed. It's a framework for bringing these technologies into your sales team and effectively going to market with them, which is, big companies, small companies, we all struggle with. It's probably the hardest thing to do. One of, if not the hardest thing to do in business. So that's exactly what it's designed for.
So now let's get into the Goldilocks formula. Talk to me about this reducing initial investment. The Goldilocks formula, Chris. Come on, give it to us.
The Goldilocks formula. So there's two big challenges that you have when launching a disruptive technology. There's two big mistakes people make. One is they did this thing called premature scaling, and this came out I first read about in the startup report probably 15 years ago. But basically, it's getting ahead of your product development and your market development with your sales and marketing efforts or your product development efforts. Yep. On the product development side, the IT world's created this MVP model to kind of to test the technology before you get too far ahead on.
Look at that's agile iterative. You've taken that iterative mindset in the agile market entry methodology and practice.
So it's the same concepts, but we're applying it to the sales process. So this but if you look at it, what's the mistake? It's scaling up, and we've seen it we see it all the time. I was just talking to a podcast, a guy leading podcast yesterday, and he hears it all the time. But what companies do is they scale up their sales and marketing effort before they have a proven business model and a sales model to execute it, which means they're just burning cash and time. So premature.
It's so wild, Chris, because we got both of us can go story after story after story. Just add more salespeople.
Yeah,
give them a script. Give them the script.
Everybody on this phone call has probably experienced it firsthand or heard about it or been close to it. But yeah, it happens all the time.
And that's the thing that you think that you do such a good job as starting to bridge the gap around the VP of sales, realizing that there's two areas that they'll have to work in. They'll have to work in the repeatable sales process model that makes them their money, but they can't use that model to work in disruptive product sales. They're going to have to create a practice, a team that operates separately from the repeatable sales process team.
They have to create a team that's going to discover the repeatable sales process for the disruptive technology instead of their regular sales force that's executing the sales process for his existing product already. So what's the Goldilocks formula? The Goldilocks is doing two things. One is not premature scaling, not scaling out sales and marketing, so you're wasting resources. Number one. But number two is it's then applying just the right amount of resources, people, capital, and company overall resources to go through that learning process as efficiently, as quickly as possible. And that's the key. When you're launching a disruptive technology and you're at the flat end of the revenue curve, what increasing revenue doesn't increase your valuation because it's so incremental, it's so small at that stage, it doesn't have a big end. There's two things that impact your valuation at that stage. One is keeping your expenses down appropriate to the stage you're at. That's kind of the Goldilocks formula we're talking about. And the second thing is getting to the inflection in your revenue curve. That's figuring out what your repeatable sales process is as efficiently as possible. So then you can accelerate your revenue. And then at that point, as you're approaching figuring out your repeatable sales process, that's when you start scaling your resources to accelerate the growth of the market.
Yes, when you have that RSP, the repeatable sales process. Until you find the RSP, it's all about premature. You're premature.
You're just gonna be applying resources, people, and capital to an outcome. So think of it this way: you put, before you get to the repeatable sales process, you put $1 in, you get 50 cents out.
Yeah.
Once you get to that inflection point, you put $1 in and you get $10 out. So until you figure out the model to put 1 in and get 10 out, there's no sense in adding more to the front end because you're just going to be wasting. You'll be putting 1 in and losing money. It's kind of as simple as that.
Because it's almost like this build it and they will come. You just throw more people at it, but they don't realize they might know how to sell, but they don't know how to sell the product to the persona and what is the process they need to follow. They don't
so
know it.
What salespeople are trained to do, and you and I have talked about this before, is they're trained to execute a sales process that's already in place. If you don't give them that sales process, then they can't do their job. That's fundamentally what we're talking about.
All right. So the Goldilocks formula. Now you're looking for just right, right?
Just right. Not too much, not too little, but just right. And that's the important, and also this is why startups probably do a little better job at this. They're so capital and resource constrained that they can't, premature scale to something.
I like it because I have read more studies where startups are starting to be fed incrementally. So instead of being given $2 million off the bat, it's like, okay, let's feed you based on what you're doing and then increase if you got into a repeatable sales process.
Well, if you've got a smart venture firm, they know what you and I are talking about right now.
Yeah.
They know that even if they give them too much money, they're going to waste it.
They're going to burn it. It's a known fact. It happens. Nobody does. Everybody burns it.
But they also put pressure on them to drive revenue instead of figuring out the repeatable sales process and getting the scale. This conversation we're talking about what drives valuation. They put pressure on them to drive revenue, which actually prevents them from getting.
Yeah, it prevents you. It does.
So
it clouds your perspective. You don't get a chance to research, read. Because let's move to number 3 here: discovery. Let's talk about the validation process that is interwoven with this whole thing. So, you got to get the repeatable sales process. You want to use the Goldilocks formula to control your cash burn. Don't get too fired up about extra revenue. Look for the repeatable sales process, then begin to invest. But what are they doing to get to the repeatable sales process? Talking about discovery.
So what ends up happening is, and we see this all the time, is when companies build a go-to-market strategy, when you build it around a product, an incremental product, you kind of know the market, you can build out a plan, you can figure out who your target customer is because you actually worked with them already. You already have them as customers. You can figure out the messaging. You can figure out how to do lead gen because you're already doing that, but you've got an incremental product. So now you're just talking about new features that address an additional benefit that they hadn't received before. So in that environment, you can kind of, the assumptions you build into the launch plan are kind of based on facts that you already know to a large extent.
Yeah.
Right. But when you're doing disruptive, it's just those assumptions that are built into the go-to-market plan. Most of them, a large percentage of them are not accurate. They're wrong because you haven't done this yet. So
you're working off of information that you have based on what you think the behavior is, even though the behavior of our customers are going to change.
Yes, that's pretty much
crazy to think about this. Think about that whole scenario. We build this whole slot of information. We build the personas, we build the scripting, we build the process. And then we don't even think the fact that the base foundation of this is that your customer's behavior is going to change because of the disruption.
Right.
It necessitates discovery. You cannot not discover.
You can, but we know the result of that. It's failure. That you and I call it the innovation death spiral. Where you cannot discover, you actually execute that plan, and what ends up happening is those underlying assumptions that are not then reassessed and validated or invalid. You just keep going with those same assumptions. You keep applying an execution sales model against it. And we run into trouble. We get a couple customers, then we see a dip in revenue. We see the sales reps are not performing at optimal levels. With their existing product lines, they might call on 10 customers and get 2 or 3 sales of those 10 customers. With a disruptive product, they call on 50 customers and maybe get 1 or 2 sale out of it because so they're operating at a low level. So. And then what ends up happening is instead of going back and questioning those underlying assumptions around your ICP, your messaging, your lead gen, are you getting the right leads? Instead of questioning that, we just double down. So we put pressure on the reps. We come up with a new comp plan. We come up with
the new comp plan, new territories, different type of rep, different type of training program, new script.
Yep, all that stuff.
All that stuff, baby.
Different.
Fired the VP of sales too. Don't forget we got fired the VP of sales too. It's their fault.
well, that eventually what ends up happening is they let go of sales forces and they let the VP of sales and they basically do a reset and start all over. Sometimes it goes all the way top to zero.
What we're saying is that you have to discover. The very premise of this is that your customer changes. You might have some ideas, a hypothesis of what you think is going to happen,
right?
But you have to discover it to be sure that's the case, or what is the case.
And what's the data you need? You actually have to have some early customers to start.
Let's talk about that. What are some of those pieces? What's some of the data points that you look for?
So the beauty, kind of the one thing that's kind of beautiful about this is it's pretty much sequential. What the key milestones are. So one is who are you calling on? Who's your ICP, and what's the problem you're solving on?
We got this ICP, but is it right? Are they the ones being disrupted? Is somebody else being disrupted? Who's the right person?
Almost 100% of the time when you go to launch with a disruptive product before you have customers, who you think your ICP is not who your ICP is after you have 10 customers.
Amen.
It's almost a guarantee, David.
Amen.
Even if it's not a complete shift in the ICP, it's at least it's a nuanced shift, or it's a significant enough shift that you're pointing at the wrong person coming out of the gate. And
how about the behavior change in content, or at least how you're talking about how they're going to use it's going to change, because you don't know. You have to learn how they're using it.
Well, it becomes who's your customer, what's the problem, and then what's the specific use case. So that's the use piece of it. And then out of those three things, that's kind of your first place you got to figure out. And you may have, a lot of times you'll have one to start with, and that's sufficient, but you might have two. But then after that, based on those three things, now you develop your messaging. And what will end up happening after your first 5 or 10 customers, marketing should be paying attention to sales on who those first 10 customers are, gathering the data from that, and completely, almost 100%, redoing all their lead gen messaging.
That's right. Readjusting based on what you've learned. And that's what you talk about, the fact that that discovery process needs to include a lot of different people. Like R&D has to know what you're discovering. Product management has to know what you're discovering. Marketing has to know what you're discovering and be able to understand that, right?
Yeah. And I almost, well, this is my bias on it, David, but I think sales needs to lead all of those components at this stage of the company or product development.
And that would be the right thing if the sales VP had the right framework by which the rest of the organization trusted that person to be the front of this, and nobody ever does.
That's unless
they're using Agile Market Entry.
If they're still using Agile Market, unless they have a leader of that team that knows the things you and I are talking about. But that person, that team that's leading that sales, I think of it, so all this, when you're discovering, you have to be getting data. What's the data you're getting? You're getting the data from the customer on up. How are they responding to, are they the right ICP based on who we're calling on? Are they responding appropriately? Are they responding to the messaging? Are they responding to the sales process?
For anybody that used Lean Startup, that's the experimentation stage. That's the education stage, and the metrics you use for your experimentation. You just pulled that into the discovery phase of Agile Market Entry, that's what I love about it, because you need to be able to understand those learning mechanisms and the value of learning, which is significant. That's the value proposition, is the learning, not the revenue.
When I tell clients when I'm working on this, I always, at this stage of development, the knowledge you're gaining is much more valuable than any revenue.
Gigantic. Absolutely.
I will always, now revenue, don't get me wrong, revenue is important because it's an indicator, but it's not a North Star. Your North Star is something else. But the knowledge you gain is 10 or 100 or 1,000 times more valuable than any revenue you gain. Plus, any revenue gain is, again, we're flat end of the curve. It's not going to increase your valuation at all. Again, what's the goal? The goal is to get to that inflection point.
Yeah, valuation only happens to repeat and scale, or ARR. That's what you want. Repeat. You just don't want some offshot revenue you got. You want to show repeat and scale and ARR, but you don't want to go into this trying to repeat and scale. You go into this discovering to get to repeat and scale.
Yes.
So let's end with this. We got 5 minutes left. I love when you talk about this stuff. Tell me about the talent. Tell me about the talent you need to do this job right.
I think more, yeah. So the talent. So first of all, the talent is very specific to this stage of the people that can sell at this stage when you don't have a repeatable sales rep. Again, remember we started that most sales reps are trained how they execute a repeatable sales process or proven sales process, however you want to frame it. The people that can discover a proven sales process and sell at the very first time at this exact same time, they're a very small percentage. In the sales learning curve, a Harvard Business report, they actually coined the term, and I love the term. They call them Renaissance reps, and basically they're these people that they're divergent thinkers, so they can think big picture, but they can also convergent thinkers, which is your typical sales rep, where they can actually execute the process and drive a.
They want both. It's like I'm a much more I'm a divergent thinker. I'm gonna go out there and figure out something that's different, that's goofy, that I'm gonna break things, but I don't converge sometimes and try to find, okay, now where do I scale? I mean, I do it, but not like you're talking about here, because they need to do both. They need to have the balance. When they smell it, they need to start digging into it to see if that is the RSP.
Well, not only that, they have to have the mindset of the sales rep and take a deal all the way through to the close.
That's the other piece that I love when you talk about. That is the fact that that's why this can't. So when we debate a lot of times, folks, I debate that this is really could be product management, Chris. Come on. This could be a really good business development person, Chris. Come on. But the rubber meets the road on those two big pieces. One is they have to converse. They have to be looking for the repeat. As a business development guy, I pass that on to somebody else. I don't care about the repeat, right? As a product management, okay, I got this great product. Here's all the different stuff. Pass it on to somebody else. The other piece that's so important in this is they have to take a sale all the way through.
They have to take
business development people are not salespeople. I'm sorry to say. There probably a lot of people might be mad at me for saying that, but they're not true salespeople.
So say that again. Who's not
true business development people aren't true salespeople?
No,
they're not.
Well, they're wired differently than a salesperson. It's just the nature of the beast. So
this is why you can't just say our biz dev group will do this or our product management group will do this.
These people have to have sold, and they have to be effective salespeople. They have to.
It's not like they're not there. It's just that nobody really takes the time outside of your framework to really think through the type of person you need to search and discover and find a repeatable sales process. And close on it.
David, I'll tell you, sales reps don't even think about this. I've worked with sales reps that fit this profile. They don't know it about themselves. I'll have these conversations with them, and their light bulbs will go off in their heads of why they do what they do. And, I remember one guy out on the West Coast, and, the last thing he wanted to do was the VP of sales to come out and visit with him, who was an East Coaster, because it would because this guy didn't know how to do the Renaissance type of sales. They didn't know how to develop it. And he would come in and mess up his deals all the time. So he would keep them out.
Yeah.
But when I started having these conversations with this guy, the light bulbs started going up. It kind of explained to him why he did what he did, how he operated the way he operated, because of this profile they have that's different than most sales reps.
That's the incredible piece of this to me, is that it's like the salesperson, they have to want to sell, they want to converge, they want to figure out the repeatability, because ultimately salespeople just want to make a lot of money. But they have to be divergent enough to search. They have to be curious enough to look, to explore, to find it for themselves. Almost like they have to be not curmudgeons, but people who don't believe unless they touch it themselves. Like they'll get this ICP and say, "I don't believe this," until I go there and figure it out myself.
Well, yeah, and when I run into these people and they're in a company that has a disruptive product, but they haven't been given the repeatable sales process, a couple things will happen. One is they know what sales leadership is telling them is not right. It's just doesn't. And they empirically they know, because they get out there and they know it doesn't work. What they do different than other sales reps is they'll take what they're learning from each customer and they'll start creating their own ICPs.
Yeah.
They'll start creating their own call points. They'll start creating their own messaging. They'll start working with R&D to figure out what's in product development. So they'll sell what they have today, but they'll use.
I love that. We both have seen that. I mean, and the thing about it's great, but it's not great because it's not being utilized to convert it into a competitive advantage. And really, at the end, we only got a couple minutes left.
Yep.
What we try to say, I think, is with agile market entry, unless right now all the innovation happens from startups, and we see this all the time, right?
Yep.
All innovation startup, disruptive startup. Why? Because big companies can't do this. They can't. They more and more. They can't. But you can.
They can.
You can.
Possible. And
absolutely possible.
It's very possible.
This is the silver bullet. The competitive advantage that you need is in this methodology to bring these things and test these things to market.
Yeah, well, and this is kind of the last point I want to make, David. It's not, this advantage is not just for the disruptive product they're selling. I honestly think,
exactly.
Well, first of all, going back to what Hamid said, we can't not innovate anymore. So people have to, these big companies have to embrace innovation within their processes, but within the product. So they have no choice. Having a sales team that knows how to launch and develop the repeatable sales process and discover and develop the repeatable sales process for disruptive products, I think is what's going to set a lot of companies aside in the future as leaders in the field and continuing to be able to lead. This is the sales piece that's kind of the last quarter mile of all the innovation.
You're right. The last quarter mile of the true win. I think you just want to go sit there and keep buying companies to try to get you that innovation. And 1 + 1 = 0.5 or 0.3 or 0.1.
And the last thing I'll leave it with, David, with respect to this point, I think what this does, it turns what is a major threat to big companies into a competitive advantage.
I want it. I want this to happen because I'm going to steal more market share. I want this to happen because I'm going to make more money.
Exactly. All
right. Well, we've got to fly. We've already gone beyond our time frame. Mr. Morrison, as always, phenomenal information, phenomenal job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's been a good day, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.